Here. My name is Dirk Foley. I'm an outreach advisor for Provider Solutions and Development, our outreach team. Today's conversation is about understanding physician compensation. I know we build this as maximizing your paycheck, but understanding is going to help you do that. So thanks for taking some time today to join us and to delve into this very involved subject matter is what I want to say. So let me talk a little bit about who we are. Provider Solutions and Development is a leader in the physician recruitment realm. We place over 1,400 physicians and providers throughout the nation annually, and we've been doing this for a couple of decades now, so we've got some expertise in this. More specifically, the outreach team was founded because we work with just over 20 internal resident programs for Providence and our associated family. And we continue to get the fact that residents are relatively underprepared when it comes to the job search and knowing what they need to know to meet the job market and land their dream job successfully. So we provide a free service that ranges from CV reviews to conversations like this on provider compensation. And we do that so that when you are making negotiations and signing on the bottom line, that you're doing so in an empowered way and an informed way. So again, thanks for joining us. I'm joined today by two experts and colleagues and friends, Erik and Laura, who I will let them introduce themselves. Laura, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Laura Riddell. I'm a senior physician compensation consultant with Providence Health System and happy to be here.
Your hair is shorter than in your headshot.
That's true.
summer look. And Erik, good morning.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my name's Erik. I guess my beard is slightly longer than in my headshot, but I am also a provider compensation employee at Providence in the same team as Laura. And prior to that, worked for another West Coast regional healthcare system, Sutter Health, in their finance and provider compensation departments. And just a little personal background. My wife is an OBGYN, and so although I, did not go through the gauntlet of medical school and residency that you all are going through, I was right there beside her, and big part of our friend circle has gone through that as well, and so kind of seen it from both sides, both from the professional standpoint where I sit in my job, but also with a large part of our friends and family having gone through similar experiences.
Outstanding. Well, thank you both for taking some time to share your expertise with our audience today. Want to just give everybody an overview of what Erik and Laura are going to lead us through. We're going to talk about the anatomy of physician compensation. I think that's an appropriate medical term for this. How your paycheck gets built, basically, the working elements of that, which is the RVU unit. We're going to take that RVU definition and example and apply that to some real life compensation models. We're going to talk some about value-based incentives and risk adjustments that are a part. And then we'll talk some about the compensation elements that are within your contract when you get those in front of you, and for questions to ask and things to understand about compensation models that are offered to you. So we're going to talk, I want to say, just as a disclaimer, this is a very involved subject matter. There are more questions than we could possibly answer in an hour, but we're going to do our best to give you some basic primer and a structure on which you can better understand and perhaps know things you want to find out more about. We're here for questions. This is also a dialogue, so if you have questions as we go through this in the way, please put them in the chat. We're monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get those answered either real time or at the end. So the anatomy of physician compensation, Laura, I think you're going to talk us through
Yeah, absolutely. And sure, Dirk. Thank you. I think the background you gave about our intent here is kind of the perfect foundation, right? There's a lot that we could talk about when we talk about compensation. But I think the lens through which we're looking at it today is really intending to talk through common structures and help you when you move forward in your process with recruitment with various organizations. If when you have a compensation offer in your hand, or perhaps more than one, then you can really understand what that means and the implications of some of the contractual language and that type of thing. So let's jump right in. And I really want to start with kind of some basic structures that you will commonly see as you start receiving those offers. So this is by no means comprehensive, but that's kind of the most common structures. So one, you're probably somewhat familiar with production plans, and we're going to talk a little bit about work RVUs as well in this, but it's essentially paying you $1 per work RVU, or also known as a conversion factor for all of the work RVUs that you generate. This is the pretty traditional fee-for-service model in which you as a provider really only get paid if you see a patient face-to-face. And then shift-based plans. So this is pretty common in emergency medicine, hospitalist, right? Things like that. It's essentially a production model as well. Only the unit of production in this scenario it reflects the number of shifts worked or hours worked. And then lastly, salary plans, in which there is no strict production component. It's just a flat salary, and then expectations are managed, traditionally through sort of quality management with your supervisor. So you may and actually likely will see some hybrid of one of these together. And so we'll go into it a little bit more in detail, but I think on the next slide, the first question I think that is common is, what is a work RVU, right? I mentioned in a production plan that in a traditional model, you're paid per work RVU. But I think in my previous experience with recruitment, I think I was a little surprised by how few physicians have been given the tools they need in order to understand what a work RVU is and how it impacts their compensation, including physicians that have been in practice for 30 years. So I'd like to start there. If it's too foundational for some folks, then please bear with me. We'll make it quick. But essentially, when you as a physician, when you see a patient, every medical diagnostic or surgical procedure or service has an associated 5-digit CPT code. So, and this is probably familiar to you, right? So when you see a patient and you chart on that patient, that you enter that CPT code, which identifies the unique service provided, right? Each CPT code has a relative value unit assigned to you or assigned to it by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And so that's the RVU, right? The relative value, that's the overarching. And each CPT code translates to a certain number of total total RVUs, I should say, or relative value unit. So the CPT code for a surgical procedure would look different than for a basic follow-up, for example, and would thus correspond to a different amount of RVUs as a reflection of the difference in time and energy and training involved between sort of the complexity of those two appointment types. So we'll show you an example here shortly. And an RVU, right? So CPT code translates to a certain number of RVUs, and an RVU is broken into 3 components. There's the practice expense RVU, which is the cost of keeping the lights on, right? That pays for rent, equipment, supplies, scheduling, etc. That is on average about 45% of the total RVU. And then you have a malpractice component to that RVU, which covers professional liability expenses, and that is on average about 5% of the total RVU. And then you have the physician work RVU, which reflects, again, the time, skill, and training and intensity that you are giving in with that given service, essentially. So that is on average about 50% of the total RVU, and you will see that referred to as WRVU or work RVU. So for each work RVU that a provider produces under a basic production model, they'll be paid a specific dollar figure. Sometimes that's called the dollar per RVU, or the work RVU rate, or the market aligned rate, or the conversion factor. And there's a lot of different names for it. But I want to note that when you're starting out in your career, some specialties in particular, it's really common to see a salary guarantee in the first 1 to 3 years of employment if you have a production-based model. So it's really meant, right, if you are coming from out of the area or you are just fresh out of training, right, then it's meant to give you time to get your feet under you and build your practice and your patient panel. And then at the end of the time, that time frame, you would roll into the production model. So, right, you wouldn't walk in the door with a full panel. And thus, if you're getting paid on production and it's truly the eat what you kill model, then you may only have 3 patients to begin with. So you'd be making a pittance. And the organization needs to make sure that you have a foundation upon which to work, right? So it's common to see that salary guarantee in the first 1 to 3 years of employment.
Hey, Laura,
Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in and add a couple
Please do.
additional perspectives or pieces of context as the work RVU that Laura has been talking about relates to the work that you do in the hospital, in the clinic, et cetera. See, depending on your residency and how you've been trained, frankly, there are many residencies where you don't go into a lot of detail about how the work you do translates to these codes and therefore translates to RVU values. So you may have different levels of familiarity depending on who you are and where your training is. But I know there are some residents, some folks that I talk to who come out of residency who have never had to code a single procedure or visit their entire time in residency, and others where they're much more familiar with it. But as you notice on the screen here, these 2 examples of 5-digit numerical codes corresponding to a level 2 office visit and a level 5 office visit, the things that they list below them don't have anything to do with the diagnosis of the patient, right? The patient could have COPD in a level 2 or a level 5 office visit. They could have, diabetes, they could have this or that. And it's that those are diagnosis codes, those are separate, and those are not, they don't have relative value units, those RVU values attached to diagnoses. It's less about what the patient has, and it's more about what you are doing for and to the patient, right? So if that visit with that patient was a quick visit and they weren't very complex, yes, that may correlate to certain diagnosis codes that they may or may not have, but it's the work that you do with them that turns into a value, a numerical value in that RVU system. So when you get out of residency and you are going to a job, it depends on where you're going, a medical group or health system. They may have a infrastructure in place that does this, deciding on which code is appropriate for the work you do and coding it appropriately. They may have coders that do that for you, or there may be a system where you're a little bit more responsible for doing the coding yourself, or it may be a joint approach. So even if you're not familiar with this CPT codes, those 5-digit numerical codes and the RVU values that are associated with them right now, that's okay. But depending on where you're going in your job, we definitely recommend that you become more familiarized with the common CPT codes that are in your specialty, and when each of them are coded, depending on what you do for the patient. So I know that's a little bit of an aside from the compensation plan, but just wanted to note that even if you haven't had experience in this before, it's good to familiarize yourself. And this is all publicly available information. You can go on to the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services website, the cms.gov, and look this stuff up. It's all available to you.
That's a great ad, Erik. Great.
Assignment of those codes, Erik, with what I hear you saying, is based on the chart notes of what actually happened in that patient encounter.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's a good nuance to point out, Dirk, is that it's more than just what you do for the patient. It's what you do for the patient that is also recorded in the EMR, right? So if you do something for the patient, but you didn't write the appropriate chart note, and so we can't prove that you've done that service for the patient, then your employer, your health system, or your medical group can't go bill the insurance company for it. So you have to have the proof. I mean, and obviously, like, there are malpractice reasons why you'd want to chart effectively, but also reasons for billing and coding that you'd want to chart effectively in all your chart notes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good call. And actually, Erik, would you mind walking us through this slide to give us a couple examples of how this might play out?
Yeah, certainly. And I'll just harken back to what I said a minute ago, where that this level 2 office visit at the top of the page as an example, that's going to be a patient. It might be a patient who's relatively healthy, who does not have a lot of comorbidities, who is coming into you for a single problem, right? It's a young, healthy male who, you're seeing in an office visit, who fell on their bike and that think they, sprained their ankle or something, sprained their ankle. So this could be something like that. It's the history is going to be problem focused. It's going to be a single point examination, or it's going to be a relatively simplistic examination and straightforward medical decision making. But you may, the next visit, have a patient come in who has myriad problems. They have 3 different chronic disorders, and they're coming in with let's say chest pain or stomach pain, in a quadrant of the stomach, and you're saying it could be anything, and you're going to have to go through a comprehensive examination. You're going to have to consider all their current ailments and comorbidities that they have. It's going to be, a lot of trial and error for the medical decision making. So that's you're going to spend a lot of time with that patient, and you're going to use a higher level of complexity with your medical decision making. And that would be an example of a level 5 hospice visit. So those are just 2 examples, if you're in the primary care space, of how you'd interact with patients, and then how they'd get a code associated with the work that you did and that you charted.
Thanks, Erik. We had a question in the chat about kind of synthesizing the shift-based versus production-based model, and saying how might that be different for shift-based care. And again, I think it really does vary by employer, how up close and personal the physicians are themselves to assigning codes. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I would say typically, if you're in a hospitalist position and you're in a shift-based model, obviously you're going to do the necessary charting for the admits and the rounding and the discharges, et cetera. And then, it is dependent upon the health system, but usually, it's facility-based. They're going to have an infrastructure typically at any large hospital system where they're going to have the billing and coding done for you. But more often you see physicians having to take control of their own coding when you're in like a small private practice and you don't have a large organizational structure that can provide coding experts as separate positions.
Thanks. Yeah, and I would say that if there's any takeaway from today for our audience, it's to just be informed. Ask your employer, how does this happen within your group, within your practice, so that you can understand how closely you're going to be related to assigning codes in this particular example. We've got a lot to cover, so let's keep moving forward. We're going to now take that work RVU component and apply it to a couple of different models related to physician salary and how those get developed. Laura, I think you're going to be on point with this again, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, again, we sort of mentioned that we anticipate your skilled physicians, and the likelihood of you going out into the job market and having multiple offers is strong. And so we want you to be able to kind of weigh the pros and cons of the different types of models to identify which is the best approach for you. So in this example, organization A is offering you a straight salary model to the tune of 200,000, and these numbers are entirely made up, right? Organization B is offering you a production-based model. So remember, when you're fresh out of residency, most employers will give you space to build your practice before you're held accountable to a production threshold. So this illustration may be the structure that you roll into after 1 or 2 or even 3 years after hire. So in this production model option for B, right, you may hear your salary referenced as a draw salary. And remember that in a production model, you're simply being paid per work RVU that you produce. But how does that organization ensure that you're drawing a consistent paycheck? How do you ensure that you're not guessing what will be on your paycheck from pay period to pay period? So a draw salary, I just want to dip into this really quick to give you some context there. It really just sets the amount that you'll get paid on your paycheck before any production reconciliation. So it's based on an estimate of your future production, right? It's essentially an advance on your future production. So at the end of a prescribed time, perhaps 3 months, the organization will do what they call a look back, in which they look back to see how much you've produced. So there's upsides and downsides to a production model. In this, generally for your draw salary, the organization will choose a salary rate that they anticipate that you'll be able to meet easily. And then anything additional is going to be a bonus. But if you don't cover your threshold, the organization may lower your draw salary, and they may even ask you to pay back the difference. So, but if you've produced over your threshold, you see a bonus lump sum payout. So going back to this example in organization B, they're only offering you a base salary of 180,000, which seems at first glance less appealing. In this scenario, your threshold is set at 3,600 work RVUs for the year, and your conversion factor, that dollar per work RVU rate, the dollar figure paid out for each work RVU, is 50. So playing this scenario out, in application, if you meet but do not exceed your threshold, your total take-home cash compensation will only be that base salary of $180,000. So in that setting, organization A is a better deal. So right, 300 or 3,600 work RVUs is exactly your threshold. So if you produce just at your threshold, you'll take home $180,000 in organization B. But if you exceed your threshold by, let's say in this scenario, 400 work RVUs, right? We're sort of playing that out. Yeah, let's see that you exceed your threshold by 400 work RVUs and you produce a total of 4,000 work RVUs for the year. In that scenario, you'd see a payout of an additional $20,000 in production bonus. So the total cash compensation that you would receive under either model is basically a wash. You're bringing in 200,000 regardless. And if we continue to play that out, let's say that you produced 4,400 work RVUs, so you were 800 over your threshold. Now your production bonus after the look back period is 40,000. So your total cash compensation potential at organization B now is actually $20,000 higher than the static salary that was offered to you with organization A. So this is a pretty basic scenario to play out, but essentially when you're job hunting, it can be hard to anticipate how highly you will produce because there's a number of things that can impact that. And so when you're in the process of looking for jobs, this is your opportunity to ask your employer some key questions to help you assess your potential future earnings. Examples are, what is the average level of production for other physicians in the same clinic? Are they meeting that threshold? Are they exceeding that threshold? Will my salary be guaranteed starting out when I build my practice? And if so, for how long? And additionally, I think this can really play in, what does the clinic support look like? So talented support staff can have a huge bearing on the efficiency of your practice, and which in turn really impacts how you're able to produce. And the lack of that support system can make a big difference, right? So I think another one also is what mechanism does that organization have for tracking your production as you go along? So let's say you have an income guarantee for the first 2 years. During that time, do you have real-time, easy access to your production reports so that you can adjust your practice over that 2 years to make sure that at the end of that salary guarantee, you are where you need to be, right? Or is it going to be sort of a surprise, pull back the curtain at the end of 2 years and see where you're at? So if you're going into, what did you say?
There's also the element of how does the organization, whether that be a health system or practice, work in support of physicians starting out? I mean, are they going to help promote your practice? Are they going to do some advertising on your behalf? Are they going to, introduce you as a new panel member, new physician in the area to help you build that practice in that first couple of years?
Absolutely. That's a great call out, Dirk. And in the last few slides, really, I want to note that I've really focused solely on the money, right? Because I want to make sure that you understand the mechanics of each kind of compensation model so that you can be knowledgeable in your negotiations as you start that job hunt. But remember that money isn't everything. These two models may well represent differing cultures of practice at their respective organizations as well. So a salary model does cap your total earnings, but you're likely to have a good sense of security and sort of a guaranteed level of income. An advantage of productivity-based models is that you're kind of rewarded for your extra effort. And to some degree, the sky's the limit with regards to earnings. But that said, a production model can start to feel like a grind culturally. It has that potential to feel like that hamster wheel, right? When physicians reference being on the hamster wheel, they're usually talking about a production model. And a production model also can potentially focus less on patient outcomes, and could create sort of a potentially overly competitive environment between physicians that are sort of seeking those work RVUs. So just remember that the type of compensation model, there's pros and cons to all of them, but just recognize that they generally align well with the organizational culture. And so might breed questions that you have when you're going into it, so you can better understand the working culture that you're walking into and not just your compensation plan.
Yeah, sure. Such as, how is it that you came to have this particular salary model for your practice?
Sure. Yeah.
I give you an insight into how they practice and why they practice that way.
Sure. And how do your existing physicians like that compensation model? Is it popular? Is it working for them?
Are they meeting those thresholds and feeling good about what they take home,
Exactly.
as well as work-life balance? And that gets into your own personal career goals and aspirations and values. You're creating the segue for us, Laura, which I love, because we're going to talk next. And I know in my research, I'm seeing that organizations specifically in 2022 and beyond, the models are changing. They're creating, they're more fluid, they're more dynamic, if you will, to meet the needs both for recruitment of new physicians, but also retention of those physicians. So we'll talk now a little bit about part of that adaptation, which is quality and value-based incentive programs.
Yeah, and we'll play out a couple of scenarios in this as well, similar as we did with the straight production model. But Dirk's completely right. More often than not, the structures are starting to develop as the landscape for healthcare changes. So more often than not, you'll be presented with a hybrid of multiple models. You might see quality or value-based metrics that's becoming increasingly tied to compensation. So your organization's metrics, they're going to be something measurable. If you have a VBI or value-based metric, it's going to be something, or it should be something measurable, and they usually align with the employer's strategic initiatives or their payer contract reimbursement incentives. So examples of that could be patient satisfaction scores. It could be patient access initiatives, like extended hours or something along those lines. And another common we see is screening questions or exams like depression screening or osteoporosis screening or cancer screening. Or how, another example would be management of chronic conditions like COPD or diabetes. So it's pretty likely to see some part of compensation tied to your patient panel as well in a primary care setting, which we'll talk a little bit more about here shortly.
And Laura, I want to add too that depending on the organization that you go to after your residency, that organization could be on a different part of the path toward compensating for value-based incentives or quality incentives. And the reason that industry-wide organizations are on that path in general is because there really has been a kind of a push from the top. The federal government and Medicare as a payer, and also state Medicaid systems cascading down from that, have begun to start putting an emphasis on population health, on value-based outcomes, and having incentives in the way that they pay health systems and groups as to how well those health systems and groups are measuring on certain quality or other value-based metrics. And so in turn, the groups then want to have their cost structure, meaning the amount of salary and compensation they pay their physicians, align with that, right? But it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem, because if you as a health system start paying too much of your physician compensation on quality measures, say you pay, I'm going to make this up, 30 or 40% of the total compensation, you all base it on, you base 40% of it on quality measures. but only 5 or 10% of your incoming revenue as a company is based on quality measures, you have a big disconnect, right? And it doesn't work. If you start doing really well in quality measures, you're paying your physicians all 40% more, but you're only getting 5% more in the door, you're not going to last very long as a company. So these companies that employ physicians, they have to do a balancing act a little bit of, we want to incentivize things that not only are good for patients and patient outcomes, but also as best we can align it with the money we're able to receive from insurance companies, both private, commercial insurance companies and government payers. And if we go too far off the mark, then we might not be able to fund all the salaries that we promised. And so the reason I mentioned that link between how medical groups and health systems get paid versus how you are going to get paid as a physician is because of exactly what Dirk said a couple minutes ago. These are changing over time. And I think a great thing to ask as you come into a position, if you see them having a material portion of your compensation package be based off of these quality or other value-based incentives, I think a really good question to ask is, how long has this been in place, and where do you see that changing or growing over the next couple of years? Because they probably, as a company, are in the middle of a journey themselves to a more value-based way of both receiving money in and paying money out. And so you want to come in with eyes wide open to say, what does it look like now if this contract I'm signing says, 10% of it is withheld for quality incentives, but also, does the company have any idea of what that might look like in the future when I'm more established in this practice? Is that going to change? And they might not know the answer, to be fair to the employers, but I think it's a good question to ask.
Nice add. Yeah, I was seeing in my reading that another great question to ask is, how do the physicians in practice feel? Are the value-based incentives, are those measures attainable? I was seeing that a good portion of physicians were saying, they struggle to meet those, whereas others, like 30–40% are saying, yeah, we can meet those with relative ease. But as you're saying, Erik, what direction are we heading in? And the other thing that I know is that those value-based incentives are based geographically, regionally. So there could be a focus on a particular health concern in Atlanta, Georgia, that isn't the same thing in Los Angeles, California.
Sure.
As an example.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on this slide, Laura?
No, I think we can move on to the next. Yeah. Thank you. I think what we want to do now is talk about, right, I mentioned that you'll see sort of a hybrid model of various components. And so I want to layer in some value-based compensation incentives into the example that we were showing earlier. So now in this example, organization A, in addition to salaries, offering an incentive payment for meeting or exceeding value-based targets. In this example, it's $20,000 or 10% of their base salary. And I want to note that often for value-based metrics, it's generally not an all or nothing. It's usually incrementally awarded. So for example, you could earn 10,000 of the 20,000 potentially if you meet half the metrics, right? So, and in organization B, they have decided to layer their value incentive into the conversion factor. So it's still a production model. And in here, they've added an additional $10 potential per work RVU. So you will always earn, excuse me, that $50 per work RVU. But you do have the potential to earn up to $60 per work RVU if you meet value-based metrics. So the difference with organization B is that the pool of money available to you for meeting those value-based metrics is variable in size, depending on how productive you are. So if you're highly productive, you'll have a bigger potential payout for meeting the value-based incentives than if you were a lower volume producer under this same model. And I think we probably move to the next, Dirk. I want to talk also about risk-adjusted panel size. So panel payments, this is seen pretty much exclusively in primary care. It's a way of approaching compensation from a population health perspective more than that traditional fee-for-service or face-to-face model. So instead of being paid per face-to-face visit, as traditionally done in a production model, you are paid to keep a panel of patients healthy. And common question is, why is it risk adjusted and how is it risk adjusted? So doctors care for patients of varying complexity, and the time and the expertise that is required to care for a 25-year-old male is not the same degree of time and expertise that may be required to care for an 89-year-old woman with multiple comorbidities, right? Both of those patients are counted on your panel, but the 25-year-old will likely be counted at a lesser rate, and the 89-year-old would be likely counted at a greater rate to reflect the difference in complexity and time in keeping both of those individuals healthy. So the means of, I think, risk adjusting panel size is pretty common in practice. How it's risk adjusted can vary a little bit from organization to organization, but just generally note that those with greater difficulty of care are likely to count sort of as more than one in that, so that to make up for that complexity.
Laura, how would that differ from what would be a capitated model?
You know, actually, Erik, do you mind if I punt this one to you? I feel like you've done a great job of explaining this in the past.
Sure, not at all. Yeah. So capitated refers to when, and it's usually on the payment side, how are we receiving money in for this patient population that we're taking care of? And it refers to a certain subset of services that you as an organization are agreeing to do to keep that patient healthy, right? And it would cover the majority of things that would be needed to keep that patient healthy. And then the organization would typically receive from the insurance company, whether that's a government insurer or private insurer, it would receive a per member per month dollar amount. I'll give you $1,000 a month just to keep this person healthy. And it's probably less than that, but excuse me. But what that means is that you would then, as an organization, your incentives, your behavioral incentives for that patient is to, more on the preventative medicine side, right? At least hopefully, right? Where you are keeping that patient healthy and out of the, ED and out of the doctor's office as best you can by, whether it's practicing preventative medicine, medicine management and medication management, doing those screening questions, catching things before they become big, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all that's going to fall into a panel payment method, usually for physician compensation, but it doesn't always have to. You can certainly have patients who are on a capitated payment model from their insurance company, but when you see them as a physician, you may get paid $1 per RVU to see them, or you may just get paid a flat salary, even if they are on a capitated payment model from the insurance company. So it doesn't always align, but yes, from an incentive standpoint, typically you're going to see things like managing a panel of patients and getting paid compensation based on managing a panel to be often lined up with the way the company is getting money for taking care of those patients. So that's where those would align. And the other thing I want to mention is that, this is going to be pretty typical for primary care. Any of you who are specialist physicians going out, you may not have your own panel, but depending on the organization, there are a few I've seen that still pay compensation based on, managing your population of referred patients. Especially with certain specialties. I mean, I can think of things like cardiology or podiatry or something like that, where you're wanting to, the employer is wanting to incentivize the physician in that practice to practice preventative medicine, to not churn patients and, get them back in the door every month, but rather to manage a population. So although panel payments are typically reserved for primary care physicians, you may, depending on the specialty, end up seeing some incentives along those similar lines.
Thank you, Erik.
So continuing to move on, Erik, I think you're going to talk to us. We're going to move now into talking about contracts, but specifically the compensation elements of a contract. And again, this is how when you're talking with your future employers or potential employers, things to understand, things to know about your contract, just so you're aware of how your paycheck gets built, how it comes to you, and how to get the best bang for your buck when you're signing on the bottom line.
Sure. We are unable to, in this particular power hour, frankly, due to time and combination constraints of showing you every possible, dollar amount for every possible specialty and what's good, what's not good. And frankly, we'd probably be doing you a disservice if we just showed you a single number to say that this is good or this is not, because it really does depend more than just the number. As Laura mentioned earlier, it's you got to look and make sure that you're comfortable with the compensation dollar amount, but that it also ties in with what has already been talked about, but with Dirk and Laura about culture, and work-life balance and opportunity and scope of practice and all that good stuff. So we know that there's so much more to it than compensation, but when we're looking at elements of a contract that you want to sign and you're trying to find the compensation elements, first of all, you should look for dollar signs and find out everywhere in the document that it has a dollar sign, and those are going to be all your forms of direct compensation. And so, as we mentioned, it could be shifts, it could be salaries, it could be production-based models. And so you might have to do some math. So you get a contract and it might have something like Laura gave it as example with organization B, where they have a number of RVUs and then $1 per RVU amount that you get incrementally if you passed a threshold. And you might want to sit down with some pen and paper or an Excel spreadsheet and do some examples, model it out and say, what would this look like based on what I think I can do? And so I would encourage you to kind of sit down and do some math when you find out the compensation, if it's not very direct, like a direct salary. Look at the compensation guarantees. So what is guaranteed and what is based on your production or behavior? And then the length of the contract. So how long is this contract in place? Is it a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or is it an evergreen contract, meaning it never expires? Typically, they do have a termination date. That is normal. So if you get offered, for example, a 2-year contract coming out of residency, that's fine. It doesn't mean that they want to let you go after 2 years. What it means is usually they negotiate or sign people on 2-year rolling agreements. And so often a good question to ask is, if you see a termination date for an initial contract, figure out what would the next contract look like, right? Is it typical for you're maybe going to be part of a medical group and this first contract is an associate position, but then you could become eligible for a shareholder position? What would that contract look like? And what are the typical terms of that contract? Even if you're not signing that contract today, you want to know what's happening in the future. Or if the initial contract is all guaranteed salary, does that mean that after 2 years, when that contract ends and you're going to sign a new contract, is it still going to be a guaranteed salary? Or do they expect you to have sort of ramped up your practice in those during that initial contract period? And they're going to actually put you on a different model, like a production-based model in the next contract. So the initial contract that you review for a potential employer may not have your forever compensation model. It might just have your compensation model for the initial term of that first contract. So it's really good for you to ask the questions of them. What would this look like in a subsequent contract? Payback periods are often connected with upfront money. So you may have, for example, a signing bonus. Signing bonuses are very common for physicians new to a practice. But often the employer wants an incentive for you to stay. They don't want you to take a signing bonus and then leave in the first 6 months, right? They've invested a lot of money and time into getting you to come there and to help start to build your practice there. So there may often be a section that says, yes, you get this signing bonus up front, but if you leave, within year 1, you pay back so much of the signing bonus, or if you leave between year 1 and year two, maybe you pay back a smaller amount of the signing bonus, but still some. And then after year 2, it's forgiven, something like that, right? So those can be structured as either a payback period, or sometimes it's even written under terms that are called forgivable loan. which is kind of confusing, but they'll give you upfront money. And then they structure that money, they pretend it's a loan and say, you don't have to pay the loan back with money, you pay it back with time spent, as an employee for us. And if you're here for, 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is, we'll forgive that initial loan we gave to you, which essentially just turns it into a signing bonus, right? So look, there may be different types of language in the contract that call it different things. But at the end of the day, it's upfront money that they're wanting some assurance that you'll stick around. So there's a payback period.
And that includes things like loan repayments, like student loan repayments. And as I think we said last year, the higher the dollar amount upfront, usually the longer term of how long they expect you to be a physician in good standing.
Absolutely, Dirk. Additionally, malpractice insurance or tail coverage should you leave. Those are things that should be called out in the contract. You want to make sure if they're not, you understand who is paying for them. And if it's not the organization up front, would they consider it? Call ratios is another thing mentioned on here. Often when you're a specialist or even a primary care doc at times who has to take call, you're part of a call pool, and there's going to be a regular amount, expected amount of call for you being in this position. And that may vary a little bit if someone leaves the practice or they have a new person join the practice, right? It's not always going to be the exact same, but there should be some kind of maximum amount of call that you should be expected to take. And anything above and beyond that maximum amount, let's say you're an ortho surgeon and you are, signing onto a practice where you're going to take 1 in 3 call. So you're on call essentially every third night, right? If one of the people leaves that practice or they go, someone goes on a medical leave or something like that, you're having to cover more than 1 in 3. Now you're doing every other night, 1 in 2. What is your compensation for that excess call, right? So if you're expected to take regular call, know that number one, typically, most specialists that are expected to take call, that's just kind of going to be part of the package. So they're not going to call it out separately. A lot of times they're just going to say, hey, your salary is X, or your, compensation model is X. And then, by the way, as part of this, we just expect you to take call, right? But you want to see some sort of provision as to, well, what about if I have to do more call than expected for an extended period of time? Is there an excess call rate that I get? Or what's the policy around that? So it's good to know that up front, so you don't accidentally get yourself into a real pickle if you are, join a call group and 2 out of the 4 physicians leave that call group, and now you're stuck with 1 and 2 call with no end in sight, right? I mean, obviously that wouldn't be good no matter who you are, but at least being able to know that you're paid for the excess is useful. Same thing with moonlighting or just extra shift pay. Like if you're in urgent care and you're going to do extra shifts, or a hospitalist, such as the per diem hospitalist suggested in the chat, and you're going to do more than your contracted amount of shifts per month. What does that look like? Is it just paid at the normal shift rate? Are there bonuses for things like weekends or holidays? Know that up front, or ask if it's not directed in the contract. Other things I may have missed, Laura?
Not that I can think of. I think you kind of covered it all. And you mentioned with call ratios that the standard call is often not part of the contract language. So I think you covered everything pretty adequately as far as I see.
I wanted to add that in conversation with Dr. Neat Darko recently, and this gets back to just understanding what's in your contract and making sure for sure what that agreement is. That is the sum total of your relationship with your employer. So they mean business. He had a component in his first contract which said if he did moonlighting, that the employer got a percentage of that. And he thought to himself as he read it, they can't be serious about that. And at the end of the year, they came back and had done some assessment on his 1099 and said, we saw that you made X amount of income and we want our 10% or whatever their percentage was. And he had to pay out and thought, oh, they were serious about that. So just making sure you know what's in your contract and what that means for you, as well as any tax implications. We talked about bonuses and loan repayments and all that sort of stuff. making sure your tax attorney is advising you about how all of those things will impact you on tax day.
Yes, we are not tax professionals here on this call, but absolutely recommend that you do get a trusted tax attorney for which you can have these questions answered. And I know that sometimes that's easier said than done, but very useful and worth their time, as well as having you know, an employment law, a physician employment law attorney look over a contract for you if you are not 100% confident about the language in that contract and what it all means. I think it's very useful to pay whatever, a few hundred or $1,000 or something for a few hours of an attorney's time to look over it and explain it to you in some plain language, as well as to what it means for you in your future. And to Dirk's point on the contract language in general, I think that look through all the pieces, and when you don't know something, ask. It's more appropriate to ask questions to the person who gave you the contract, and I mean, they should be able to explain it to you in plain language as well.
Great. I think that's a good ad. And I absolutely second that, Erik, as far as having a physician sort of on retainer and available when you get a contract so they can look at it for you. It's very much worth the fee to know what you're getting into there. And I would additionally add, this is just a side note about contracts in general. If you're, especially if you're looking, so using Providence as an example, there's sort of standard boilerplate language generally in the contract. So there's some language in the contracts that an organization may not be willing to change at all. But some of the terms, and if you know, I think the biggest takeaway is probably if you've talked about compensation elements, you make sure they're all in there. You know, and that's where that lawyer can really come in handy in reviewing that. It's kind of catching pieces that a layperson like myself, you know, may not catch, right? So very much worth it.
And I will plug our GME Lounge, which is the repository for all of these recordings. This recording will be posted to the lounge eventually. So if you want to review this again, we have also the conversation with Dr. Darko that's there, and a conversation that we did last year with an attorney, Westland. Why am I forgetting his first name? Dennis Westland, who had some great points about attorney review of contracts. So we're going to run out of time, so I want to be sensitive to that. Laura or Erik, which one of you is going to take directed versus indirect compensation?
I'm happy to. Do you have any preference, Erik?
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, either way. I think really the point of this slide is really just to make a note that we really have talked pretty specifically about direct compensation, about cash coming into your pocket, right? But that's not to say that indirect benefits aren't important and can't, you know, and depending on the circumstances can be really pretty critical. So, right, indirect compensation basically reflects non-wage compensation. Or I'm sorry, indirect. So yeah, anything that falls outside of your wages and salaries would be reflected in indirect. So that includes health insurance and tuition funding and educational opportunities, daycare, vacation, right? As well as flexible work schedules. All of those things are really important because an organization may, you know, weighing the direct versus indirect, they may be offering you an astronomical salary that on paper looks like you'd be crazy to say no. But if you have paltry health benefits that come along with that, then you're going to be paying out so much for health benefits that's going to eat pretty heavily into that salary, right? So it's just remembering that the indirect is also plays in even to the financial picture of a total compensation package. So don't underestimate that. Really consider that when you're looking at it. Don't just look at the salary, look at the benefits as well.
Yeah, and this is especially important when you're a physician considering the differences between an employed contract and a per diem or a 1099 contract.
Yes.
I know we had a per diem hospitalist question earlier in the chat. So if you're looking at per diem or 1099 compensation, make sure you really understand who's paying those employer side payroll taxes, who's paying for malpractice insurance, who's paying for, you know, all the other, you know, your health insurance. Stuff like that, and factor that in to your scale when you're weighing multiple offers.
A comment on the in-between, Laura?
Oh, yeah, I mean, just loan repayment, I think we put sort of as in between because sometimes if you see loan repayment as part of your total cash compensation package, sometimes they'll be paying it directly to your loan company, right? Or sometimes they'll be paying money to you to pay to the, so it's just sort of one of those things that could be considered either direct or indirect, but either way weighs in, to the whole picture regardless. So.
And we are seeing it being more popular to have loan repayment as an incentive as part of a contract. That it's often for only a certain set number of years. It's not ongoing compensation, but it's almost more a get you in the door. Here's a few years of loan repayment, kind of like a signing bonus.
Yeah.
But it does make a difference at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So finally, I know we're getting short on time. Just questions to be asking your potential employers, things to understand about your contract, what type of mentorship. We talked some about that. You're a brand new physician starting out in the practice. How do you get to build so that you know what you need to know in order to be successful and be efficient in your practice? Staffing resources. Laura mentioned the fact that that can make a huge difference in the efficiency of your practice. Policies for working partial FTEs. Employers, as we said, are being far more flexible and accommodating to create a package that works not only for them, but for you and your career goals. So negotiating what is going to work best for both sides. What happens when you outproduce your draw when you're on a guarantee? Are they going to be transparent about that and perhaps move you to that production model sooner or not? What's expected when you roll off your guarantee? Sometimes employers will be good about showing you, here's how you're doing in the quarters ahead of, when you make that change into full production. So making sure you understand how that transition will operate when it happens. Provided information to set you up for success. Again, being able to have them be transparent about how you're doing in meeting your production, meeting your value-based incentives. How are the other physicians in the practice doing? And what are the call expectations? Erik talked well about that. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. If there are questions, I know we're at time. Again, thank you for your attendance. Excuse me. Today we are here. I have a little ad about our outreach at psdconnect.org. That's our email. That comes to my colleague, Emily Hartley, and myself. We're here to help. If you've got further questions, reach out to us. If we don't know directly, we're well connected. We're well networked. So we're here to help you. It's a free service. So if you need someone to take a look at your CV or review your cover letter, if you want someone to connect you with recruitment opportunities, if you want to practice interviewing, we're here to help. So let us know. And then additionally, I wanted to call out that in December, we'll have another one of these where we'll have a couple of our recruitment colleagues talking with us about career fairs and job boards and how to put yourself out there in the job world. Laura and Erik, thank you so much for your insights into compensation. I really hope this was helpful for all of you. It continues to be educational for me in learning about how physicians get paid. And finally, we're here to help if you need us. So have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.